What is going on, true believers? James Hancock here. I'm back to review a little movie you might have heard of called Avengers Endgame. And I'll hold off on spoilers initially, but I should warn you in advance that you might need to wear a diaper when you go see this movie. Not because of the 3-hour running time, but there are just so many scenes where you just might drop a bomb in your trousers from pure glee and excitement. While quite different from Infinity War in ways that I think will surprise a lot of people, especially during the more character-driven first half, nonetheless, Avengers Endgame ends up being everything you want the movie to be and more, taking the superhero genre to new heights that makes so much other work going on in the genre feel utterly irrelevant by comparison. Between Infinity War and Endgame, Marvel has given the scope and grandeur of classic historical epics to the superhero movie. And anyone out there right now writing a traditional origin story where a superhero gets their powers and fights one villain, they should just delete their work and start over, because after tonight, audiences will be expecting so much more from this genre in the many years to come. But when I got home from seeing the movie, I almost had writer's block there for a bit, because trying to write a review of this movie can almost give you paralysis through overanalysis. There's so much to get to, and there's so many different angles that you can approach the movie from. But just for starters, let's just say that Avengers Endgame is a pop culture phenomenon, the likes of which we will rarely, if ever, see again. It feels very much like the end of an era, with so many actors, writers, and filmmakers moving on to other things. The status quo of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is gone, never to return. But the best part of the MCU has always been its willingness to let time pass for characters to grow and change or possibly die. In an era where so many franchises are terrified to move forward, wallowing with their unimaginative prequels and spin-offs, the MCU has surged ahead into new territory, and I have a feeling it's going to take me at least a couple days to chew on all the little details and changes in this movie. We're obviously going to continue to see plenty of big movies on an annual basis, but Avengers Endgame is so much bigger than any one movie. This movie is the culmination of 11 years of work for Marvel Studios, essentially a giant mosaic comprised of 22 movies total, an unprecedented achievement in movies. But for many longtime Marvel readers like myself, the movie also represents the culmination of nearly 60 years of storytelling, since pioneers like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby changed comic books forever. Back in the early 60s, Marvel laid the foundation for everything we're enjoying today, introducing legends like the Hulk, Spider-Man, and Iron Man. They dusted off and reintroduced Captain America, and even converted the mythological character Thor into one of Marvel's most beloved icons. Or if you really want to go old school, this movie is the culmination of 80 years of storytelling, going all the way back to Marvel Comics #1 in 1939, where we first saw the Human Torch as well as the Submariner, who I think will make the perfect villain and or hero in future Fantastic Four movies. My hope is that for the MCU, the best is yet to come, but it's hard to imagine any franchise ever again reaching these heights. But it comes to building a tapestry of interwoven stories and characters that pays off in such a fashion. None of us will ever forget how we felt in a crowded theater, seeing so many heroes disintegrate before our eyes this time last year. But if anything, Endgame managed to surpass that experience with several scenes where you could either hear a pin drop in the theater, or at other times you couldn't hear anything at all because the audience was roaring with laughter or just in thunderous approval by the spectacle they were witnessing. Also, I'm starting to realize it's totally futile for me to try to discuss this movie without spoilers, so this is my first and only warning. 3, 2, 1, that's it. Bail out now if you haven't seen the flick yet. But of all the amazing things going on in this movie, the story that impacted me the most was that of Captain America. He's been my favorite superhero as far back as I can remember, and no character has been better served by the MCU than Cap. I regularly see people on Twitter saying that his own trilogy of movies is the best trilogy for any superhero ever, and while Joss Whedon might have had a slightly dorkier take on the character in his first 2 Avengers movies, but in Winter Soldier, Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame, the Russo Brothers, alongside screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, have given the character the perfect arc and eventually the perfect send-off, better than any I could have ever imagined. Marcus and McFeely have now written my 4 favorite movies in the MCU, and whatever Marvel needs to pay them to keep them around, I hope they do so, because they made this aging Cap fan very happy. I first learned that Cap was worthy of lifting Mjolnir back in 1988 when I read Thor 390, and while I suspected we might see something like this ahead of time, nothing could have prepared me for how epic it was watching Cap beat the snot out of Thanos with Thor's ancient weapon. Also, something tells me that for years, fans are going to be quoting Ant-Man's proud proclamation, "That's America's ass," anytime they want to give someone a compliment. But of all the great scenes featuring Cap, this movie also gave me my new favorite moment in the MCU, where we see Captain America all alone, prepared to face off against the invading armies of Thanos, and suddenly we hear Sam's voice say, "On your left," and then we're treated to what's probably the most epic superhero shit ever conceived by a human being, as every single superhero killed by the snap, as well as the armies of Wakanda, Asgard, and a hell of a lot of wizards, all show up and join Cap in this heroic charge toward Thanos' legion of soldiers, it was hard for me even to breathe as Cap uttered the classic rallying cry, "Avengers Assemble," before the two forces charge towards one another and collide in just this insane battle royale. But on a much smaller scale, Cap's reunion with Peggy, along with handing down his shield to Falcon, has to be the most satisfying moment emotionally in the entire film. I've always hated the term sidekick when it comes to Bucky and Falcon. Off and on, they've been Cap's partners for decades in the comics, and as fellow veterans, they're obviously the two most deserving of the shield, not to mention that they've both worn the suit of Captain America in recent years in the comics. But Falcon hasn't always gotten as much screen time as he deserves, and as he and Bucky head into their own show on Disney+, I anticipate a lot of cool action scenes with the two of them throwing the shield back and forth, much like Cap and Bucky did versus Iron Man in Civil War. But as much as I love Cap's story, Thor's story across the movies continues to fascinate me as well. It's incredible seeing just how much his character has evolved and improved since he first hit the screen. No characters had more ups and downs, and like cutting diamonds, Marvel keeps finding new ways to make his character more engaging. In Endgame, Thor finally gets his chance to redeem himself by aiming for the head when he straight up removes Thanos' head from his shoulders. Admittedly, that doesn't solve the problem because Thanos has already purposefully destroyed the gauntlet, but it is satisfying nonetheless to see the son of Odin get some revenge. And Thor really has some serious soul-searching to do in this movie, but his descent into drunkenness gives the movie some of the best comedic beats. Seeing Thor geeking out on the couch with Korg talking shit to gamers online absolutely had me howling. And his arc ends with a bold new beginning for the character. After basking in the epic grandeur of seeing Thor wield both of his weapons simultaneously against Thanos, we see a brand new fresh start, both for Thor as well as his people. With Valkyrie now sitting on the throne, rebuilding Asgard right here on Midgard, Thor gets the chance to put the Asgard in Guardians as he joins what are now called the Asgardians of the Galaxy, a perfect fit for his character moving forward. As Taika Waititi first proved in Thor Ragnarok, Chris Hemsworth can be funny as hell when given a chance, and he's already proven that he has incredible chemistry with the various members of the Guardians. So I'm sure James Gunn and Chris Hemsworth will have an absolute blast working together on Guardians Volume 3, and of all the films that we know about on the MCU schedule, that film has me most excited. But getting back to Endgame, I love how the movie really allows us to soak in and appreciate just how much narrative we've enjoyed since Iron Man back in 2008. While time travel can get really slippery in movies, as gets pointed out in a particularly funny scene about all the various movies featuring time travel, but this film incorporates it brilliantly by allowing us to see what amounts to a highlight reel of great moments in Marvel history as the Avengers attempt to assemble the gauntlet before Thanos gets his hand on the stones. My theater erupted like a pack of maniacs when we saw Cap say "Hail Hydra" to some corrupt S.H.I.E.L.D. agents back in time in order to get his hands on Loki's scepter. Or seeing the older version of Cap fight the 2012 version of Cap, and when we hear the younger version say, "I can do this all day," it was absolutely hysterical seeing the older Cap kind of shake his head wearily in resignation. And seeing characters like Alexander Pierce, Henry Pym, and Howard Stark in the past brought back a rush of memories from so many earlier movies. And what I appreciated is that when the dead return 5 years after the snap, they don't rewrite Marvel's history. That might be a little weird for Peter Parker as he heads back to school in the fall, who have all aged in his absence, but structurally the film does a pretty good job of cleaning up the timeline when Cap returns all the stones as well as Mjolnir to the past where they belong. Of course, none of this would be possible without the Hulk going full Professor Hulk in this film, with Banner and Hulk finally merging their identities, a concept that's been explored many times in the past in the comics. The best example, which was during Peter David's legendary run on the character when he was working with artist Dale Keown and then later Gary Frank. This plot twist also gives us a really satisfying conclusion to Hulk's journey across all these movies, as he's the only one strong enough and smart enough to wield the new Infinity Gauntlet safely. Physically, he might not ever be the same again, but because of the time travel, we get to see some of the funniest Hulk smash scenes from any of the movies, including his blind rage over having to take the stairs down after the Battle of New York. While pretty much everyone gets a great hero moment in this movie, there was a great comic book callback of Hulk basically holding up a mountain of rubble to keep his friends safe after Thanos blows up Avengers headquarters. I've been dreaming of seeing a moment like that ever since I read Secret Wars number 4 way back in 1984. It's incredible just how balanced this film is, with everyone from the original lineup of the team getting an opportunity to shine. Hawkeye has great scenes on the run with the Infinity Gauntlet, trying to keep it out of Thanos' hands. Black Widow makes the ultimate sacrifice by giving her life in exchange for the Soul Stone. As does Iron Man when he chooses to give his own life using the Infinity Gauntlet to show Thanos and his army what it feels like to be on the receiving end of the snap. Actor Robert Downey Jr. has enjoyed so many brilliant roles over the years, but to the world at large, he will be remembered as Iron Man for many decades to come. And without his astonishing portrayal of Tony Stark in the very first film as a jumping-off point, the story of the MCU might have ended up a pale shade of what we know and love today. I can vividly recall a time back when I was in business school when we first heard the news that Marvel would no longer be licensing their characters at other studios and that they were going to start their own slate with Robert Downey Jr. in the lead as Iron Man. At the time, I bought as much Marvel stock as I could afford against the advice of my friends. Well, a few years later, my Marvel stock got converted to Disney stock, and I hope my friends remember what bad advice they gave me all those years ago. No one knew who the Avengers were back then, apart from giant comic book freaks, but now the whole world knows who they are, and they will never forget. But I think it's time for me just to run through some epic details because I worry that I'm being so long-winded in this review, I won't give everyone their due. But breaking the characters into small teams for the time-travel heist was a great touch, especially with unusual pairings like Rhodey with Nebula as they get to hunt down Peter Quill at the opening of the first Guardians film. I have to admit that Captain Marvel never really manages to mesh with the rest of the team, but for her fans out there, and I could definitely hear them in the crowd, we do get to see her full power on display when she flies straight through Thanos' ship. What I love was seeing Thanos at his most diabolical without the help of the Infinity Stones. In an early scene, we see him return from somewhere wielding this giant double-bladed sword, and his armor is completely splattered in blood, and one can only imagine what he's been up to prior to that moment. And the finale has about 100 of these great little details, and if you blink, you're going to miss so many great beats, like Wanda getting some much-deserved payback for what Thanos did to Vision. Sadly, Vision is totally missing from this movie since he was not killed by the snap, but we know that he'll be returning in his own show with Wanda on Disney+. And speaking of Disney+, one of the things that doesn't get changed is how in the past, Loki escapes with the Tesseract, so the version of Loki we're going to see in a show will not be the version from Ragnarok and Infinity War that was slightly more cuddly and trustworthy. Instead, he's going to be a straight-up unrepentant villain like in the first Avengers film. So, suffice to say, the MCU has changed the movie business forever. Shared universes and post-credit scenes are now the norm for movie franchises, even if no other franchise has come close to replicating Marvel's model as successfully. But everyone involved in Marvel, from Kevin Feige down to the lowest PA, they all deserve to take a very long bow. So many thousands of people have been involved in making the MCU what it is today, but the sad truth is that nothing lasts forever, and inevitably a day might come where the MCU becomes stale or uncool. But for people who've been on this journey since 2008, they will remember the experience of the last 10 years very fondly forever. What's crazy is that the audience is still growing. Avengers Endgame sold 5 times as many advance tickets as Infinity War, so clearly more people continue to get on board. My question is whether or not the MCU can reinvent the wheel again and continue to introduce new storytelling innovations that make their approach feel fresh and new again. Post-credit gimmicks and shared continuity is now becoming formulaic, and with every great Marvel movie like Endgame, they raise our expectations for what comes next. And we know so little about what the future holds for Marvel and their movies. Apart from some discussion about Shang-Chi, The Eternals, as well as some sequels to Guardians, Black Panther, and Doctor Strange, we really don't know anything concrete. But with the Fantastic Four and the X-Men now back under Marvel's roof, Kevin Feige could easily start building another giant, sprawling 10-year plan that could be even bigger and more complex than Infinity War and Endgame. Personally, I wonder if Feige has another 10-year plan in him. If he tries to sustain this pace for much longer, the workload very well might kill him. But there are so many classic tales that I would like to see adapted, from the Korvac saga to Secret Wars, the Mutant Massacre, the Kree-Skrull War. And as far as future villains that can match Thanos' appeal, we have legends like Kang and Mephisto, or Annihilus if they can ever figure out how to do the Fantastic Four properly. Or they could even go super old school and bring in the Squadron Supreme, which would be the easiest way to see what it's like to see the Justice League go up against the MCU. My point is that there are decades of great stories and characters to draw upon, and they can keep this thing going theoretically as long as they feel like it. Infinity War and Endgame together remind me of the awe that I felt so many times growing up, reading these kinds of stories on the page, and if we're lucky, Marvel will continue to use the best ingredients from these comics from the past for decades to come. In any event, I'm totally wiped out from this experience. The movie is much more draining than Infinity War. I think people are going to be caught off guard by just how sad and morbid it is, at least for the first half. But as soon as I wrap up this review, I'm going to be going on Fandango and looking for the next earliest showtime that I can get myself into. But I hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. If you did, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk about comics or Marvel or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But thanks so much for the support from my channel. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards. But I guess since this is a Marvel video, I should either say Excelsior or, more importantly, Avengers Assemble. Good night.